Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today I am filming on, of all days, Veterans Day. And for those who are not old enough to remember, it was originally referred to as Armistice Day to celebrate the end of the fighting during World War I. I'm also in front of a very, very beautiful mansion. I'm at what I would consider to be probably one of the best places to be on Veterans Day. I am in front of the home of America's greatest veteran, George Washington. I am at Mount Vernon, his beloved home. Now, if you're wondering what battle took place at Mount Vernon during the Civil War, well, none. There was no battles fought here during the American Civil War, but yet Mount Vernon did play a small, but nevertheless, it did play a part during the American Civil War. And when I was here at Mount Vernon many years ago, I purchased this book, and it is going to be used as the only source for today's episode. It is called Mount Vernon, the Civil War Years. There's no doubt about it. Mount Vernon is an impressive 21-room mansion, and the Washington family took ownership of this land in 1674. And the house was originally just a 1.5-story cottage that was owned by Washington's half-brother, Lawrence. And Lawrence took ownership of the house that was here at the time and the land in 1734, when Washington was only 2 years old. It's a very, very lovely piece of land. It sits right along the Potomac River. The land you see in a way distant background, that's Maryland. So you can see why Washington was really in love with this land. And once he took ownership, he began to expand the house into what it is now. Even during the American Revolution, he was designing plans for new rooms and additions onto this house. So even during the darkest days of the American Revolution, his mind was still here at times, thinking about his home right here at Mount Vernon. General Washington died in December of 1799, a few days before Christmas, so he didn't even live to see the start of the 19th century. His wife, however, she would pass away in 1802, and unfortunately, after the passing of both Washingtons, the house fell into disrepair. One day in 1853, a South Carolinian woman named Mrs. Robert Cunningham was traveling down the Potomac River, and from the river she could see Mount Vernon, and she could see the sorry state of disrepair that it fell into, and it really saddened her, and it moved her into action to start trying to get people to donate money to preserve Washington's home here at Mount Vernon. So what happened next was nothing short of a small miracle. Mrs. Cunningham employed the services of her daughter Anne, who was an invalid from a horseback riding accident that took place years earlier. While she may have not had the physical body, she did have a sharp mind, and Anne began a campaign to raise money to save George Washington's home. And as a result of this and the donations that came in and other women that got involved, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was created with the sole purpose of saving this home. By the way, that association still exists today, and they are still the owners of Washington's home. And believe it or not, they were able to raise enough money to buy this home before the American Civil War started. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association was able to raise $200,000 for the purchase of Washington's home. And the sale took place on, of all dates, February 22nd, 1860, George Washington's birthday, just over a year before the Civil War would break out. Now, you got to realize, $200,000 in 1860 was an incredible amount of money for these women to raise, but that's how important George Washington was, not only to these ladies who would buy the house, but to the average Americans who donated money to make this happen, to make that sale possible so that this home could be preserved for future generations. 2 years prior to the purchase of Mount Vernon by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Mrs. Cunningham hired Miss Sarah Tracy from Troy, New York, as secretary for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and that proved to be an excellent choice, as Mrs. Cunningham and Miss Tracy worked together very well to not only purchase Mount Vernon, but to bring it back to life. So now let's take a look at Mount Vernon during the Civil War years. In March of 1861, shortly before her husband, Abraham Lincoln, was inaugurated President of the United States, future First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln did pay a visit to Mount Vernon. And while Miss Tracy was not here at the time of the visit, the House Superintendent, Upton Herbert, was present here during the Mary Todd Lincoln visit. And Mary Todd, over the years, maybe rightfully, maybe wrongfully, has really earned a reputation as being a somewhat miserable person. Mrs. Bergman had this to say about her. She saw Mrs. Lincoln more than once and said, quote, "There was nothing coarse or unladylike in her manner or conversation. All slang and bad manners attributed to her is false," end quote. So Mrs. Lincoln did come to the mansion prior to the Civil War, and once the Civil War broke out, this really put Mount Vernon in a very sticky situation. We're in Virginia. Virginia would secede from the Union, but this is the home to the founder of the United States of America. And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association very much wanted to keep this home out of the war. And they got reassurances from the Confederate government pretty quickly that this would remain neutral land. It was getting reassurances from the Union Army that would prove a little more difficult. So when Civil War began, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association tried to keep Mount Vernon neutral. However, that did not stop the rumor mill. At the very beginning of the war, shortly after Virginia seceded from the Union, rumors began to circulate both north and south that General Washington's body was stolen from the estate here and taken to the mountains of Virginia for, I guess, safekeeping, or maybe to be used as some sort of bargaining chip. But that rumor was false. But it also did not stop a second rumor, very similar to the first, from circulating in July of 1861. I'm currently standing in front of one of the sheep pens here at Washington's house here at Mount Vernon, and just using them as a backdrop here. Really has nothing to do with this part of the story, but on May 2nd, 1861, Superintendent Herbert did issue a respectful request that if soldiers are going to come here to Mount Vernon to see Washington's home, that they do so out of uniform and leave their weapons outside of any of the buildings, particularly Washington's home. During that first summer of the war, rumors began to circulate in Virginia that the Union Army was planning on placing troops here at Mount Vernon. Now, it's my understanding that very early the Confederate government did declare this to be neutral ground. The Confederacy, in other words, had no desire to put Confederate troops here at Mount Vernon. But when the rumor began to circulate that the Union Army was considering occupying Mount Vernon, Miss Tracy, along with Mr. Graham, who was also part of the association here, took a little trip up the Potomac River to go see Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott at the War Department to discuss this matter and try to keep this neutral ground. Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott at this time was 75 years old. He was a veteran from the War of 1812, but he was a native Virginian who remained loyal to the Union. And when Miss Tracy and her friend got to the War Department, they were met by Major Townsend, who was an aide to General Winfield Scott. And so Townsend heard her story and took her plea into the general's office. And according to Miss Tracy, she could hear some of the conversation, including the old general saying, "God bless the ladies." The Ladies Association got an agreement from General Scott that if the Confederates don't occupy this area, the Union will not. So basically, it was declared that day that Mount Vernon, thankfully, would be neutral ground. On June 19th, 1861, General Heintzelman did issue a pass to a gentleman named Mr. Smith which would have allowed him to bring provisions down to Mount Vernon. And it was indicated on the pass that Mr. Smith was a colored man. So Mr. Smith was really taking a big chance here, because if this area was indeed infested with all the Confederates that General McClellan believed were here, had that man been stopped and arrested, he very possibly could have been impressed into slavery. In August of 1861, Prince Napoleon of France, along with the Count Massey, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right, paid a visit here to Mount Vernon. And to Miss Tracy, that was the highlight of the summer, having the Prince of France here. And this is what Prince Napoleon had to say about his visit here to Mount Vernon, and I quote, "Mount Vernon to be removed from the scene of conflict, yet surrounded by them, so quiet itself that it seemed impossible the spirit of war could be hovering so near. Yet this little corner of earth was kept sacred and neutral ground." While Washington's home and the grounds that it occupied may have been neutral ground to both the North and the South during the Civil War, it doesn't mean the Civil War didn't get close to Mount Vernon. In the fall of 1861, there was a very small skirmish at Pohick Church, about 6 miles from where I'm standing. And while it was a very small battle, if you want to even call it that, it really was probably more or less just a skirmish. Fortunately, that would be the closest Civil War fighting would come to Washington's home. But there was still some issues they're going to have with the Union Army and General McClellan. So as I just mentioned, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was running into some issues with the Union Army, particularly General McClellan, who refused to honor the passes granted by Brevet Lieutenant General Scott. And it forced Miss Tracy to run the blockade, as she said, to get up to Washington, D.C., and to meet with General Scott again. Now, this is October of 1861, and by this point in time, it's pretty clear that McClellan is forcing General Scott out. And again, he's 75 years old. And so Scott says, take your grievance directly to President Lincoln, which she did. Well, long story short, Lincoln straightened out the situation, and the passes would be honored, and supplies were allowed to continue to flow down to Mount Vernon. And why did McClellan do this? Well, this might sound very 21st century. He made his decision based on security reasons. First time I came to Mount Vernon back in 2005, I was told this story by one of the volunteers working here, and that was that during the War of 1812, in the year 1814, as the British were sailing up the Potomac River to go sack Washington, D.C., the British Navy paid respects to George Washington by ringing their bells as they passed by his estate. War was drastically different 200 years ago. In the spring of 1862, General McClellan moved the seat of war from in and around Washington, D.C., and moved the entire Army of the Potomac by boat down to the Virginia Peninsula and landed in and around Fortress Monroe. When McClellan did that, he shifted the war, and also he really took the war away from Mount Vernon, and after that the Army of what would be the Army of Northern Virginia really did not come anywhere close to Mount Vernon, and so Mount Vernon was safe, and it did remain neutral territory for the rest of the war. The Union Army never occupied it. The Confederate Army never occupied Mount Vernon either. And with the exception of that small skirmish that I mentioned about 6 miles away, that's the closest that Civil War came. And as a result of this, the plantation here really lost any significant value in terms of use by either army during the American Civil War, and that's a good thing. I'm currently seated in front of a slave memorial. This was one of the first slave memorials ever erected in the United States. When Washington died, he freed 130 of his slaves. He had an 8,000-acre plantation, and thus there were a lot of slaves needed to run this plantation. But given the current situation here in America, I would really suggest that all history-loving Americans come see Mount Vernon, because who knows with the way things are going. I'm sure the woke community would love to tear this all down and build condominiums or something, but and I don't say that completely 100% joking. The way things are going, anybody in America, any American who owns slaves must be purged from American history. At least that's the way I see things going. So I want to thank the Mount Vernon Ladies Association for allowing me to film. I really, really do suggest it's a beautiful plantation. You've only seen some of the buildings that are here in the backdrop when I was creating this episode. I wanted to film inside Washington's home, but they do not allow motion picture or recordings, just still photography, and of course I had to honor their request. After all, this is their grounds. It's privately owned. It is, I will say, a little pricey to get in here. It's $28 for each adult, and an adult is described as a person 12 or older. But you got to remember, this is privately owned, and they are preserving this mansion and these grounds for not only us, but future generations. And I also want to thank my daughter, who requested this visit. Believe it or not, I can't believe it, 10 years of my life, but later this month she's going to be 10, and she really wanted to come see Washington's home. And what can I say? She is the product of her dad, and her mom's also into history too, so why not? You know, 10th birthday, brought her down with some of her friends. I asked her, you want to be in this episode with Daddy? No, but she's already been in 2 episodes with me, so I completely understand. So before I go, I do want to take you over to Washington's tomb, where the general and his wife are laid to rest. And they do request quiet over there, so I will be very quiet, very respectful, honor their wishes. And so let's conclude by just going over and paying our respects to the good general.
General George Washington,
his wife, Martha Washington. For Civil War Reports, I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. Until next time, thank you for watching. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button. Give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends. Let them know about this channel and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.